Hey, welcome to Conversations, a podcast where we seek out intelligent voices, voices that have been pushed to the fringes or have been smeared or ignored. We try to understand if in fact they have valuable contributions to give, and we do this by implementing some simple principles. Participants agree on some basic rules of conversation, but most importantly, they must see the humanity in each other. At a time when polarization is only increasing, while Western civilization is at serious threat of collapse, we believe these conversations are more important now than ever before. We hope you enjoy, but most importantly, we hope you take it upon yourself to have some of these conversations. Well, let's begin.
Okay, so hello, welcome to the third episode of Conversations. Today with me is Sharmine. Hi Sharmine, how are you doing?
I'm good, Tareq. Thank you for having me on.
No, thank you very much for coming on. You were one of the kind of first journalists to reach out to me and offer me support when I resigned from Newsweek, so I really appreciated that. And, you know, I think kind of, unfortunately, I wasn't too aware of your work before, but I've seen the name around, but kind of having had time to look into a little bit, and you know, we had a nice few drinks in West London about a week ago. You know, so kind of getting to know a bit about your history and kind of some of the work that you do. I think, you know, you're one of those many people that have come into contact recently that has a really important kind of understanding and worldview that most people are probably not aware of, or you know, for whatever reason that worldview has been ignored. So a little bit before I quickly kind of shoot it over to you, just like a little ritual of the podcast is just to quickly light a candle, which I'll do now. And it's just, the whole principle is just to, while the candle's on, we'll speak as honestly as possible to each other and kind of treat each other as human beings, even though we might, you know, disagree in some of the areas that we might get into. We might agree 100%. I don't 100% know, but that's part of the conversation.
How nice that sounds, the concept that people of differing views can talk with each other with civility, you know, and not rage, because it's all we're seeing, isn't it?
I mean, it's kind of one of the things that inspired me is, you know, I think it's one of the biggest problems in the United States and the West at the moment. You see it in the UK, for example. Anyone that's a Corbyn supporter can't talk to someone that's a you know, conservative supporter, and vice versa. They all think it's the same in the United States, and it's the same on so many different issues. And I'm sure it's happening across, you know, France and, you know, so many places where you see this polarization. So hoping that I can be some part of this change to kind of bring a bit more civility back to kind of public conversation. But another, like I mentioned as well, the other thing that I've noticed, and the other thing I'm trying to get over, is how lots of people have, you know, who have valid opinions have been smeared over the years. They've been called conspiracy theorists, or they've been called Assad apologists. I don't know if you've personally received that insult yourself. I'm sure you have.
Of course. I mean, Syria has sort of been my area of concentration the last 7-8 years. It's around the time I moved to Beirut, or based myself here primarily. And it was a natural story to cover because I was nearby and I could drive over. You know, it's about a 2-hour drive from Beirut to Damascus. And, you know, from the very first trip I took, everything seemed a little bit different than what we were reading in the English language media. But of course, it was very confusing at the time. You know, the so-called Arab Spring was raging around us, and we were, you know, even people in the region were kind of being sort of entranced, I don't know, by this one-size-fits-all idea that masses rose against horrible leaders who were then deposed relatively quickly and bloodlessly, you know, except that that's not what we were seeing in Syria. And of course, it didn't happen in 3 weeks or 3 days, and it hasn't, you know, 8 years later. But at the time, you know, when I go back to my early articles that I got absolutely smeared for, I was so naive. I mean, I was questioning. You know, the first thing a journalist needs to do is question their assumptions. okay? I have a very particular and strong worldview, but that doesn't stop me from questioning, my assumptions on a regular basis. And the first thing I wanted to know, to understand, because we were hearing so many different stories from different sides, was, okay, well, who's dying and who's killing? That would tell us a lot, And one of the first stories, therefore, I did about Syria was a very in-depth investigation piece on Syrian casualties on that list. We were being quoted casualty list figures, daily. And at the point that I investigated it was about 9 months into the conflict, 10 months into the conflict, and the official UN number was 5,000. I very quickly found out that over 2,500 of those were Syrian security forces, and the rest were a mixture, a mixed bag, because what I did was I went to the lists from various opposition organizations that I could get my hands on. I think there were 2 or 3, and looked for pro-government individuals on the list. Easily found, by the way. Then I went deeper and did some random checks on where I could match YouTube funerals with the name. And you could see from the paraphernalia at the funerals whether they were pro-government or anti. And there were pro-government people on that list. And don't forget, the time there were a lot of the rebels, the armed opposition, did not have military clothing. And so anyone dead was classified as a civilian. So I found a mixed bag of results. Half of the dead, more than half of the dead, likely were Syrian security forces. Of the others, there were pro and anti. A year later, I did a sort of recap of that investigation, and when now there were over 60,000 dead. Okay, so that number had risen more than tenfold. And I did it because the UN had commissioned an organization to look at the data from a number of these casualty lists and crunch the data and eliminate names that were repeated, or people who didn't have any names on the list, or not enough data to ascertain that this was a real thing. And we discovered that over 93% of the people on the casualty list were male. That is not representative of a civilian population. That's representative of a battlefield, So there's a lot to be learned. But during that time, and just before I put out that investigation, I had done a little bit of reporting on Syria, and I had been writing primarily for the Huffington Post when I relocated to Beirut. And the Huffington Post stopped publishing my Syria stories. They published one that got a lot of attention because I quoted from a report by Stratfor, a conservative Texas-based, U.S. risk analysis or whatever, strategic geopolitical group, and they basically wrote a report saying the Syrian opposition is lying, and they're lying big. Well, this was the first pushback narrative we were getting, and so I sort of recapped the report for my readers, and Stratfor was hacked, I think 2 or 3 days later, and the Huffington Post never published a Syria piece again. Actually, never published a piece of mine again. Never offered an explanation, despite various emails and attempts to reach them. And about a year and a half later, maybe, because I wasn't watching that closely at that point, they removed my entire archive of work from their website, save one article that was co-authored with another Huffington Post writer, which I couldn't exactly delete. So, it was my first taste with media manipulation, and how closely mainstream media was cleaving to a U.S. government narrative or a Western narrative on what was happening in Syria. And, yes, it's good to have vindication years later. I'd written in 2012 that there was a large group in Homs of opposition fighters that were talking about the establishment of a caliphate, and I was mocked by people on the left, specifically Max Blumenthal, who did this big, I quit from Al Akhbar English, which is where I was writing at the time, because these people are Assadists and Assad apologists, this so-called leftist, anti-imperialist, established figure. And, he specifically mocked that phrase of mine that, oh, creeping Sharia, he said, that about the notion that, rebels or Syrian opposition people were interested in establishing a caliphate in Syria. So, the vindication feels all right, but it's just a crying shame, because I really think the Syrian conflict was escalated because of the spin, okay? The media is so responsible, in my view, for the length of the Syrian crisis, the number of people who died, the complete whitewashing of this opposition who were very early on. I'm talking from late 2011, we knew that Al-Qaeda was in the Syrian theater, okay? We knew those bombings in late 2011, early 2012 were Al-Qaeda. I think McClatchy News was the first one that went with that story. And yet, the media continued to talk about moderate rebels. At first, just rebels, as though they were the good guys. They're in opposition, blanket phrase for everybody, from students demonstrating, as was their right, to, bearded, gun-toting, nothing against beards, Tareq. We like them here.
Yeah.
But, as the Lebanese say, you can actually see things where they have a chart of beards, and you can tell, like, the person by the kind of beard they have here.
Right.
So,
I think mine's on the...
Yours is a good one.
yeah, I'm safe with mine. Yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, so
sorry.
I mean, this is, and I wrote a piece at the time in 2012 where I called journalists, Western media in the region, media combatants, because I did not see them, in a war, I did not see them as impartial, innocent bystanders anymore, reporting on what we saw, asking questions, reflecting the truth of the matter on both sides. They absolutely, cleaved to their government's narratives. They spun the Syrian conflict into the most disturbing conflict that we've seen in this region in forever. Even the Iraq war and occupation, the level of the things these extremists would do to people, chopping up, mutilating body parts, calling the parents of the people they'd mutilated, I just never, can't even imagine that. Syria was the safest place in this region. You wouldn't lock your door, your car, security was tight. It is a security state, but one felt safe there. To imagine that such animals could come out of a situation like this, and they were being represented as saviors. So the media was very responsible for covering up the truth of the matter and creating an environment where the sort of the global populations thought that they had to continue to cheer on their government's policies in that country because the Assad government were the bad guys, absolutely, and there were no bad guys on the other side. There was no violence on the other side. That went on for years. So yeah, media combatants, and we still have them in the region. Any opportunity to exploit vulnerabilities, to incite populations as things are calming down, not to the benefit of Western governments. A Shia-Sunni battle starts up again, or, So, I don't consider a lot of these people journalists, and I don't think others should either. But for those of us who actually do ask questions and contradict the dominant narrative, we get sacked,
Yeah, I think you said a couple of interesting things that, I mean, one thing about the left being co-opted for the cause of this war, I think you mentioned Max Blumenthal. I'm not aware of that history too much, but I think even in general, I mean, especially here in the UK, you saw actually the left, even though there was an anti-war movement, you did see a large number of voices on the left kind of repeating the Assad as a dictator narrative, and we have to get rid of this, essentially the regime change thing. So it's funny how the left, who's traditionally kind of very anti kind of these things, or have started to become some of the biggest cheerleaders in the early days of the Syrian conflict. And the other thing you mentioned was about how the media is, part responsible for everything that's happened. And I think that's been an interesting thing for me, even though, I've always been very critical of the media in the beginning, because I sensed without the kind of evidence that, this is just not good journalism, or, there's a lot more to the story than we're being told. I just couldn't have the facts to say this is exactly what was going on. But kind of in the last few weeks and speaking to people like you, I think I've really kind of have my views kind of solidified a lot more in terms of, I'm actually I do really think that the media has been culpable in this, and it's unacceptable how the kind of British or Western media has been, essentially involved in this war and selling this war and failing to kind of cover it properly. So I'd love to get into some of those issues, but before, can we just take a little bit of step back of sort of before you went to Beirut, what your kind of background in journalism was, and how you kind of got to the point that you decided to cover Syria? Were you always doing foreign affairs, or?
I got a master's degree from Columbia University, studying both in my functional specialization was international media at the School of Journalism there, and my regional specialization was Middle East. So I came to this with, that right mix of both, knowing this craft or knowing this trade, and having learned what we aspired to, what all good journalists should aspire to. And also knowing the region. But I'd left it for some time and actually moved into a telecommunications, something completely different, for some years. And then in 2009, when 2008, 2009, when the bombing of Gaza took place, which converged with my joining Facebook at the insistence of a young friend, things exploded in my head again. The Middle East is a tough beat to cover because it's an endless conflict, and it's like watching a Spanish soap opera. You can come back a year later, 10 years later, and the same storyline is going on. And so I came back to it because of what was happening in Gaza, the absolute carnage. And I have to say, my own interest in the Middle East came through the issue of Palestine. I think for a lot of people, that's the case around the world, certainly students, from every nationality. So that happened. And then in 2009, the summer of 2009, the Iranian elections took place. And we were all so moved by this so-called Green Revolution, and young people participating, rejoicing, the possibility was in the air. And then about a week after the elections, and we all thought it was fraud, and we all saw that poor girl Neda being shot, and bleeding out of her mouth. She was a bystander watching the protests, and she was shot and died in front of her eyes, on a cell phone camera. And about a week after that, I couldn't believe what I was seeing on social media, the kind of language, Iranians supposedly talking about the Iranian government spending money on Gaza and Iraq and, other things, but not on themselves. It's just, very Western propaganda kind of language that actually in Iran, you don't hear people talking about, on a regular basis at all. So I also, reports started coming out. The opposition in Iran had submitted their report on fraud in the elections. When you looked at the report, it was very, very thin, and I started to wonder then. And, I think I saw my first color revolution, basically, in that story. And it prompted me to take a trip to the Middle East, which I hadn't done in a number of years. And, Gaza and the Iranian election combined got me writing, and I wrote a rant on Facebook, which got sort of sent around, and the Huffington Post asked me to write a blog, and USA Today asked me to write an op-ed. And because everyone was interested in the Iranian story, Iranians had been, what can I say? Iranians had been made pretty for us in the lead up to the election, all these sort of Western-leaning youth with green painted on their face, and pretty young girls. It's amazing what the Western media did at that time with a movement that was favorable to them. You only saw good-looking Iranians on your TV screens and in your papers, right? As opposed to the sort of dour, dark kinds you'd see other times. And that's what catapulted me into this. I started writing for the Huffington Post, and before I started, I spent that summer in the Middle East. I went to the Levant, Jordan, Palestine, and for the first time, actually, Lebanon, a country that in grad school had made my eyes roll back in my head because of the infinite capacity for conflict and infighting and switching alliances. I still can't quite figure it out. But I came to Lebanon. I'll tell you what's interesting about Lebanon. Really, this is why you see such a large amount of Western journalists over here, because you can get every view in the region in this small Mediterranean state. You want the Saudi view, the American one, the Iranian one, the French one, the Qatari one, Turkish, you name it. And so it makes for a very, very interesting place. To be, and certainly if you're a political journalist, and a very easy place to report from in the region. And then, of course, the Syrian conflict happened around the same time that the Huffington Post then stopped publishing my stories, and I got pulled into that, a country that I didn't have any particular special knowledge of, but that I learned to. And I have to say, one of the decisions I made at the time was I'm not going to read any books on Syria. So and to this day I haven't. And the reason for it is because I feel like if you immerse yourself in a book, it's not an article, it's a book, right? The brain's just the database, right? It just collects information. I feel like you can be so swayed. And I think for me, it was the time that I started thinking, well, what am I finding on bookshelves at bookstores? Like, how do I know that I can pick up a book on the history of Stalin, for instance, and this will be a fair rendition of, of history. I started questioning what I was reading. So I didn't read, I decided to see for myself. Just as a naturally nosy, inquisitive person, hence probably the journalistic career, I decided to just nose around and ask the questions that occurred to me. Because what do I want to read? What do you want to read? You want to read things that maybe reflect what you're thinking and what you're curious about. But we're getting one-size-fits-all stuff. And I think this explains this incredible search that consumers, readers are undergoing to find alternative sources of information, which is why we've seen so many alternative sources of information crop up in the last 8 years. I almost feel like Syria was this fault line, which everything swithed. I have many theories that Syria is actually the main battleground for World War III, and I can explain why that is later. But in the world of media, it became so stark. You can fool people for a year, 2 years, 3 years. You can't fool them for 8 years. Everyone started seeing what was behind the curtains in those first few years, and as a result, even publications supposedly leftist publications like The Guardian, I mean, oftentimes the comment section was more interesting and responsible and questioning than the report they were responding to. And so anywhere you looked at mainstream media where they were covering Syria or other contentious issues that contentious in terms of their narratives, you know, you would see irate readers. And that was really interesting, the word of journalism, you know. I think mainstream journalists are under siege. And those who are not absolutely ensconced in their bubble do sense it, you know.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what made the timing of my resignation was I kind of sensed that so many people have just been fed up with it. And, you know, we have almost 50 alternative news sites that, you know, that this is what I told Newsweek. It's, you know, it's getting to the point that it's ridiculous now, because with the latest, you know, WikiLeaks information about what happened in Duma, it was getting to the point of, you know, anyone could just have a look at these documents, and it's very easy just to get a pretty good understanding of what's going on. I was actually having a look at some of your kind of earlier articles this morning just to do my homework, and actually, intriguingly, I found that you wrote one of the kind of you wrote a piece about Ghouta, which was one of the sort of first big, you know, alleged chemical weapons attack, and you raised concerns about that one. And so I guess, you know, I think even though Ghouta and Khan Sheikhoun aren't as clear, but we do, I think, have fairly good evidence that in Ghouta, Khan Sheikhoun, and Duma, all of the three alleged chemical weapons attacks aren't really what what was told in the media. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I can't say that I have written a few articles on the chemical weapons or alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria in the early days, right? And I kind of left it from there because actually you had a lot of people jumping in on the issues and arguing the cases very convincingly on Twitter and, you know, social media, armchair experts, as you know, if you will, and on both sides. And I didn't go there. I'd already done my pieces questioning the issue, and I thought there were others taking it to another level of nitty-gritty that I wasn't so interested in, because it looked like people could make any facts work for them, you know, if they had a large enough platform, right? And if the mainstream media was repeating their theory. But the reason I looked at this issue initially questioningly was because, well, actually the report I did on Ghouta, there was actually a UN report. I think it was a UN report, there were some discrepancies in the story that were buried in the, you know, addendums. I don't remember what it was exactly. It was in one place where there was a high amount of evidence of the use of sarin or whatever chemical was in human samples. There was none in the environment, okay, which is not possible, or vice versa. It was one of those things. But that information had been buried, and there were other things that were not highlighted in the report. One was that the complete control of the scene was in, you know, with the armed opposition, and the UN team was only allowed in for a few hours, and they were shot at, you know, intimidated. They never saw any bodies. I mean, we had estimates of over 1,000 by the French government and some others. Where were the bodies, you know? So at any rate, the reason I questioned almost everything I was hearing was that I had seen since 2011. This was 2013, like I think August 2013, the Ghouta attack, chemical weapons attack. I had seen what happens when there, you know, the opposition, the militant opposition was feeling defeat, or if there was a big UN security meeting coming up, you know, you would have a massacre, an alleged massacre, right? It was so, it was sophomoric stuff, you know, it was really, if you're watching it on a regular basis, like the journalists were, every single time a UN security meeting came up, there was a massacre that went viral, you know, because the media blared it from their headlines, and it would set the tone for that UN Security Council meeting. They wouldn't even wait for investigations to take place. I mean, it was a shit show. Yeah, so it wasn't hard to find it not credible, you know, and it wasn't hard if you were watching the story daily to pick apart the pieces. And I found myself, I mean, I guess in 2009 when I started writing again, I did almost exclusively counter narratives. And some would say, well, is that fair? You know, are you being a fair journalist? Where's the balance? I'm not a news writer. You know, you have to do that in news stories regardless of what you think, right? This side said this, and you counter with this side said that, even if you're gonna, right? Trash one side in the piece, or stack it against one side. But in this case, I wasn't doing that. I was writing about observations and investigations, and I wasn't seeking to give you the other point of view, because that was 99.9% of what you were reading. You know, I tried to be very responsible in what I was doing so that I couldn't be smeared very easily, so that people couldn't argue me on the facts. Because they couldn't argue with me on the facts, they did the smear, you know. So of course I was called an Assadist, an apologist. I've never actually in my work ever commented on the Syrian president or what I think of him, because I don't actually think of him very much. You know, he's just an individual in this theater. There's so many components to the story, but I can't pass judgment on this person, because whatever a part of the population thinks he's done that's negative, another part of the population equally, if not more so, thinks he's saved them, you know. Because we saw who the opposition turned out to be, you know. Neck choppers, right? So I was called an Assadist, and it just actually, instead of putting me off, double down, Tareq, you know, I was like, hell no. You know, I'm not a 22-year-old to be cowed into, you know, apologizing. I never apologize. I just, you know, for something that I believed was correct. And I just asked more questions. I just went into, you know, my zone. There's something to be said for journalists not mixing with a lot of other journalists, because we then can get into bubbles, you know. And I think that's what happens with a lot of Middle East coverage. That's why a lot of these people sound absolutely like their stories, is they have that bubble, and of course they have their government's narratives, you know. Yeah, but there was, you know, Syria was very contentious. Even Akhbar, where I worked for the English section. I think when Max, for instance, quit Al-Akhbar, this big whatever, I don't even know if he'd ever been to Lebanon or Syria. He certainly hadn't been to Syria at that point. You know, he brushed the whole enterprise with, I mean, do you know what I mean? Everybody was sunk by this. But at Al-Akhbar, English, my view was the minority view on Syria. Do you know what I mean? And here was a leftist publication. I'm not a leftist, but he allegedly is. A leftist anti-imperialist publication that, you know, broke many stories, challenged the establishment. To do this to the entire establishment was ridiculous. And of course, we'd had people at Al-Akhbar Arabic who'd left because of the Syria story, as they had from Al Jazeera and other media in the region, because it was a very contentious story, which is fair, you know. Let all views be heard. But that's not what happens. You can't have one view, a certain view heard. That's what I think we've all learned, you know. And by the way, I wasn't the first. I remember at the time there was a CNN journalist called Amber something or other. She was kicked out of CNN because she smuggled out sort of tape of human rights stuff in Bahrain, and I don't think CNN ever aired that. And they sacked her. So I remember at the time going, oh my God, how can this happen? Hasn't that happened to me? You know, so it's been quite a while. you're paying attention. Journalists have gotten sidelined, undermined, delegated or relegated to, like, you know, the shit stories, etc. If they share an opinion, either in articles or on social media, Twitter, for instance, you know. Yeah, it's a tough gig.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I guess you're a little bit more on the ground, but I think another development that's kind of taken place at the same time is how the propaganda's, I think Syria's kind of been, you know, this kind of really interesting evolution of how propaganda is now with, you know, social, I mean, it links to these chemical weapons attacks, but how, you know, people like Bellingcat or just lots of Twitter and social media channels, you know, videos get put up and, you know, everyone takes them to be like an authoritative source. And because you know, everyone here in the West is so, you know, distracted, or there's, you know, millions of news stories going on, you'll just see it once in your Twitter timeline. Okay, you'll think Assad is a dictator, and you'll get on with the rest of because it doesn't really impact you. They've kind of tapped into this thing of just, you know, the culture that we're all in. So it's much easier for, you know, to take in the propaganda is very easy, but then to fight against it is very difficult.
Yeah. No, it's very true there, and particularly with Syria. I mean, it was very frustrating because you get these pictures. I mean, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, has posted so many fake pictures over the timeline of this crisis. You know, here's a devastation from Syria, but it's actually in Gaza, that kind of thing. And
I don't know how he's still allowed to kind of maintain this.
Well, I mean, he's the dictator. I think he's been around for 20 or 30 something years as head of that organization. So some ludicrously long time. And during this conflict, a lot of us fell out of love with human rights organizations and saw them just extensions of empire. But to your point about pictures, in Syria, there were a number of pictures that really stand out. I mean, you could write a book about these pictures. The little boy swept up on a Turkish beach. Yeah. The little boy in the ambulance covered with dust, you know. These are all stories that turned out not to be true, but they were everywhere. And
the most ridiculous one
is worth 1,000 words, right? But I'll tell you one that I personally have some knowledge of, and I wish I'd written about this at the time or followed up on it, was I went to Yarmouk camp, the very large Palestinian camp on the outskirts of Damascus. It was my second or third trip there. And this is after it was quite devastated. And I went to the location where, do you remember that big biblical looking picture of Palestinians standing, you know, to leave the camp?
Oh, yeah.
But it was made out like they were there for food. Okay. That I mean, it was like a wide lens thing. The area is actually quite narrow. I mean, it looked massive. It did look, you know, biblical. And I was with some people, and one of them who had been a fixer for, I believe it was Sky News, or one of the Western media outlets at the time. And as we were talking about it, he said, you know what, I was there during that picture, and it was really interesting. He was just being chatty. It was really interesting, but you know, we learned that they weren't there for food. They weren't there for food. And there's actually video that nobody really shows of what these people were doing in the hours before that picture took place. There were a few with food boxes. Most were moving around. You could see suitcases. They were waiting to exit, because at that point, what was happening is the Syrian, there would be a list of people who wanted to exit the camp. The Syrian government had to okay the list to make sure there weren't any known militants among them. And then they would be allowed to exit. But for whatever reason, fighting, no ceasefires, etc., that hadn't happened in some time. So at that point, there were well over 1,000 people who were going to leave. So they congregated there. But listen to this, Tareq. The reason we have that picture of people pressed up against each other is because they were made to wait. Now, why were they made to wait? Because UNRWA, said they had to wait because, and this is the news agency I was told, Sky News isn't on the scene yet. They wanted all their media to get on the scene. Those people were there waiting, jammed up against each other, not for food. They were waiting to exit the camp, first of all. And secondly, they were waiting that long because UNRWA didn't have all the media they wanted there, you know. So that's the story behind that picture, you know.
Yeah.
And, but of course, even if I had written at the time, I mean, the picture would have kept going and the details would have been lost.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit the other evening, but the other kind of famous, ridiculous one, I think it's the most ridiculous example, is Bana al-Abed. You know, just, I couldn't believe that, like, I was, just felt like everyone I was watching around me was just like entranced under the spell, and I just couldn't believe it. Of, you know, we're almost taking foreign policy advice from this 7-year-old girl, or, you know, and
it wasn't just that. It was the way, because we had a lot of Western media interview this girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way they would ask her questions, knowing she can't answer in English, they could, obviously, the girl didn't speak English. She was being prompted and rehearsed by adults there, including the journalists. They were absolutely complicit in using this girl to amplify their false narratives about Syria. And it was so obvious, it was uncomfortable, you know, to watch a senior correspondent from a big British, you know, media outlet sitting there talking in a little patronizing voice. This girl who clearly couldn't understand her, nor could she reply in English, you know. So yeah, that was dreadful. But I would say the biggest, most dangerous one was really the white helmets, because they weren't just this media concoction. They were an operation created by a UK military man, okay, to seed propaganda. But fair enough, we saw a lot of propaganda. These guys they had a lot of cameras, whatever. They created scenes, they lied, let's say, but they were used as witnesses by the world's governments and international bodies. That was the most dangerous part of all of this, you know, because they were absolutely affiliated with the militants. They never operated in normal areas, okay, which were also under, you know, being attacked, bombed, and more. Yeah, of course. They only operate, and I think the head of the White Helmets actually said it in a French paper, which I put on Twitter, that they only work in what they call liberated areas, which were basically Al-Qaeda dominated, and specifically in ISIS areas. You know, and we saw them in situations. I think when John Cantley, the kidnapped journalist, was speaking in one of the propaganda videos they'd forced him to make, there was white helmets in this ISIS area, you know, and you could see them. So how are they used as witnesses?
Yeah.
How? So the media is absolutely complicit in this. There's a reason, you know, I call them media combatants. They really played a very important role in this war. You know, they were in this war. They were soldiers in this war. They're not innocent observers of the human tragedy.
And just to kind of, I guess, wrap Syria up before we move on to how would you kind of summarize kind of everything that's happened to this point? I mean, what would you say is, I mean, maybe, I guess it's still ongoing because we have this sort of, you know, we don't know how Iraq and the situation in Iran is going to play out, and they're all, you know, interlocked, I think. But
yeah, I mean, the Syrian crisis happened. I mean, the so-called Arab Spring that was happening only to pro-U.S. leaders, by the way, you know, was Tunisia and Egypt. But at the time that Tunisia and Egypt happens, we were seeing demonstrations in Bahrain, we were seeing them in Jordan, we were seeing them in Oman, I think in Yemen, and suddenly we had this diversion to Libya and Syria, which happened with weapons. The others were not happening with weapons, right? So this is classic U.S. military unconventional warfare operation. And I actually did an early article on this where I linked to the 2010 leaked US Unconventional Warfare Manual, which has charts on how to go from seeding propaganda, encouraging strikes and boycotts and demonstrations to, the next level, inserting foreign money, weapons, and training into the scenario, et cetera. So Libya went all the way to a foreign military intervention. Syria did not. By the way, part of this US unconventional warfare is to create a free army, right? A liberation army and a liberation government. So we saw that very early on, the Syrian National Committee or Congress, whatever it was called, and the Free Syrian Army. Those constructs came quite early into the scenario. So that's what Syria was, and Syria failed. The reason I think they failed in Syria is because actually there was always a connection between Syrians and their government. Why do I say this? Because in Tunisia and Egypt and Bahrain and Jordan, the government provides, well, I don't know about Bahrain, but the government provides very little or bad or no services to the people, okay? They do not care about the economic plight of the people, They allow austerity measures to be implemented by foreign organizations. There's no respect for their citizen class, and it's felt, okay? That's domestically. However, governments also have a worldview. On that also, in countries like Tunisia, Jordan, and Egypt, there's no connection with their citizens, okay? So citizens are largely pro-Palestine, anti-America, anti-imperialism, anti-Zionist, et cetera. And their governments operate like in Syria, you had, although not a wealthy country, you did have a connection between people and population because you had free healthcare, you had free education, poor country, but people's very basic needs were met. It was not a country where, of course, a liberal class started emerging in the cities, which exacerbated those tensions. But that's the fault of liberalism, which was the model everywhere. I mean, even communist countries adopted this thing. On the foreign policy side, the people were in lockstep with their leadership. They were a resistance country. They were a proud Arab nationalistic country. They were anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist. They opposed Israel. They opposed America. Why would they raise up against their government? Okay, so this is why arms were introduced. Now, fast forward later, the reason Syria didn't fall is because it wasn't like those other countries. It's because it was part of an alliance at a time where alliances don't seem to matter. You look at the Atlantic Alliance, with the Americans and the European, all alliances are sort of framed because the new world order is emerging. So you had a resistant state that was very much supported by its allies, all the way, in fact, right? But their allies were efficient. They were efficient. We've not seen this in the Middle East for forever, centuries. To actually have efficiency, where there's a goal, an ambition, and then the ability to realize it. The ability materially, financially, militarily, socially, in terms of support, et cetera, to realize this ambition. And this is why we see Syria intact, Lebanon intact, Iran intact, because they have an efficiency we've not seen before, a strategic one. These are very different elements. I mean, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria, they're different countries, different groups with different belief systems, secular, religious, Sunni, Shia, Iranian, Arab, as different as you could be. And I think, of course, a very big reason, which is also why I call Syria the battleground for World War III, is this conflict in Syria attracted the attention of major global powers, Russia and China, who entered the Middle East in a way they had not been active for decades, and played a very important role in mediating this conflict and preventing it from worsening. So that changed the dynamic. And the interesting thing about Russia and China is on principles of international law and the way nations should interact with each other diplomatically, soft power, meaning economy, trade, etc., versus military sledgehammer approach that we've been seeing by the Americans and their allies. They transformed the thinking in this region, and a major power battle was fought over Syria. And we have not had a major power battle since the Cold War ended and, World War II in a sense, because there will be a decisive winner. Again, why I called it World War III, because World War III was never going to be fought conventionally because nuclear weapons exist. It was always going to be a different kind of war, the use of irregular warfare, asymmetrical warfare, propaganda, sanctions, sabotage, subversion, you name it. While that was going on, what we were also seeing, which indicates to me a global transformation, therefore this is like a world war, is that new international institutions were emerging from the sort of Russian, Chinese, entry into, they entered global politics over Syria, right? Not only were new international organizations emerging, new defense alliances were emerging, we will absolutely see a remaking of the United Nations, of the IMF, of the World Bank, as a result of this and after this. And as you can see, the OPCW, which is absolutely part of these, one of these global institutions, has really, really undermined itself and shown that this global war has entered every realm. An international organization of scientists, made of scientists and experts and technocrats, basically lied about chemical weapons in a member state, right, in order to serve one side, one global side. And so we will see this transformation happen. And I think so Syria is kind of the trigger point at which we went from the old order to the new order. It's not because of Syria per se. Syria just happened to be the battleground where all this change is happening. And of course, the Syrian conflict has been won. Okay, let's be clear about that. The conflict continues, but in a very small way. There's no way for the opposition to reemerge. There's no way for the opposition's backers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, the US, Israel, UK, and France to reemerge in Syria as a victor. And the Middle East has moved from the Levant to the Persian Gulf, has very much moved into what we can call the Eurasian sphere, which is, the new area of growth globally.
I think there's so many interesting things there, but obviously the changing dynamic you said is interesting. And I read a little bit about that there's even Saudi Arabia's relationship with Syria is changing. Is that accurate? Or?
Yeah, I think that happened for different reasons. Let's see if I can remember. Turkey entered the fray. Turkey and Iran and the Russians got together and organized de-escalation zones through this process, military de-escalation zones, process that took place in Astana, Kazakhstan, and then through another process established at Sochi in Russia, they developed a political process. Okay, so basically bypassing the idiot Geneva process that was never going to bear any results because Syria wasn't even at the table in that one. 22 countries were, but not Syria. And so, of course, through this process, there was Iran, right? This was the reason the Saudis were putting money into the Syrian conflict and the Emiratis and stuff. Iran was taking control of the ground and the outcome. And Turkey too, and Turkey joining them. Here's what happened in sort of the middle of this conflict as ISIS became a huge threat. And they were largely in the east, the mid-east, and the north of the country, okay, some in the south. But every time, and then Al-Qaeda was in the, sorry, I meant west. Al-Qaeda was in the, no, I meant east. I'm sorry. Al-Qaeda was in the western corridor from north to south, of the country, okay? And Al-Qaeda, let's just, it's not exactly divided this way, but let's say Al-Qaeda and its allies in the opposition were primarily funded by the Qataris and Turks. It's not the case. Jaish al-Islam, other groups are funded by the so the Saudis and others. But just, for the sake of this, the Turks and the Qataris had a great deal of influence over what was happening with Al-Qaeda and their allies in the western corridor of the country. So when the Syrian army and their allies would move west, it was a game. ISIS would raise up and, hit them from the back, and then they'd have to regroup, go this way, then the Al-Qaeda people would raise up. And it was a very exhausting, ping pong back and forth. And this is a hard battle for the Syrian army and its allies to fight on the ground, until the Russians came in and offered that vital air cover. So what happened is the Turks and the Qataris suddenly decided to stay still, okay? A deal was made somewhere. They decided to stop activities, allow the Syrian army and their allies to surge eastward towards ISIS, and they did it very, very quickly. The American with Russian air cover and the ground cover that the Syrians had, they did it very quickly, much quicker than the Americans, who waited a year and a half before, launching their first major efforts against ISIS, and only because the Russians had now entered and the Americans had to do something,
Yeah.
But the Qataris and Turks got quiet. After that, that's when the Saudis and the UAE cut off Qatar, okay? So Turkey and Qatar became enemy number one for the Saudis, all right? And the battlefield changed, okay? That's when the battlefield changed. The Saudis came in, for instance, and started to fund Kurdish activities. It became Saudi Emirate, UAE versus Qatar, Turkey. And that changed the battlefield. And it was always interesting. Like I always say with my argument about efficiency, it wasn't just efficiency on this side, the side of the resistance axis and its new allies, Russia and China, but it was inefficiency on the other side, okay? Because every time the Saudi-backed, American-backed, Qatari-backed, Israeli-backed, French-backed groups would take over an area, from the Syrian state, they would be within 48 hours shooting at each other. They didn't have common goals, and so I think that's why the Saudis and others, UAE and others, have made a play for reconciling with the Syrian government. There are other considerations that take precedent over the old beef. And they knew they'd lost at that point, of course. And of course, another big consideration is that the Saudis and Emiratis were hoping that they could convince the Syrian state to ease Iran out of there entirely. Okay, a huge Israeli demand, and these three countries, the Saudis, Emiratis, and Israelis, have become, solid mates during this time. They wanted Iran out of the theater to be replaced by Russia. Of course, the Americans don't want the Russians there, but the Saudis and Emiratis and Israelis perfectly happy to have Russia there, just not Iran. So this is part of their argument. Okay, we'll make friends. Maybe we'll pay some billions for reconstruction, etc. Who knows the deals behind? But basically, considerations changed, and that's because the strategic motivations for destroying Syria were always weak. They were to get at Iran, but now the region had changed. Iran had been empowered during the Syrian crisis. Iran, that was a country with a small alliance, became a major regional player and a major international one, because the Russians and Chinese look to Iran in West Asia as a solid anchor of stability in a country that shares their view on the use of soft power, international law, sovereignty, territorial integrity, etc. So Russia and China discovered each other more over Syria. Russia, China, Iran absolutely discovered each other over Syria. And so the world changed.
And yeah, the reason I brought up Saudi Arabia, because I guess, and this shifting into what happened in Iraq last few days, is that we had that Soleimani, before he was assassinated, he was due to have a meeting with Saudi officials, and so that seems, well, I don't quite know what to make of it, but it seems like there was efforts between Saudi and maybe Iran to essentially change their thinking on the region.
I mean, you can't trust the Saudis and the Emiratis at all in this region, like the Turks, to be quite frank, under Erdogan.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: apparently, I don't know if this is 100% true, but apparently, when media has told us that Trump did not notify his European allies about the imminent assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, but apparently he did alert the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis to it. So if in fact the Saudis had sent a message to lure Soleimani to Iraq,
so they were probably more involved, not.
Then I would say the Saudis are going to be a target of what comes next in this region.
Okay, so
on the other hand, I don't know that that's absolutely true, but this is what's being said.
I've heard reports similar to that. That makes more sense than they're trying to make peace with Iran. They were probably
no, but I'll tell you, the Saudis. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is a hothead, absolutely, and a nutter because of how he acts with impunity and all. And I think the Saudi establishment will at some point, and has at some point, weighed in and said enough is enough, with his crazy military adventurism in Yemen, the biggest humanitarian crisis the world is seeing today, and his execution, of Jamal Khashoggi and many other imprisonment of people, targeting of the Shia, etc. The Saudi establishment has seen, is obviously uncomfortable with how things have been moving, and I think they step in. The Saudis have been very conservative in their foreign policy always. They still exist in the region, regardless if they have American power behind them or whatnot. They still exist in the region. They've always been very pragmatic about that. They made friends with the Syrians after a long period of silence and enmity. They made friends just before all this started in Syria. And what's interesting to me is that before the so-called Arab Spring kicked off, I actually wrote a piece on this, that actually countries in the Middle East are finding their own way forward, solving problems together without any Western help, without any Western footprint. At that point, the Saudis, the Turks, the Qataris, the Iranians, the Syrians had stepped in to help resolve political sort of post-election matters in Lebanon, political post-election matters in Syria. They were stepping in to troubleshoot in Sudan, and they were opening borders, visa-free borders for each other, countries that had been hostile in the past. There was a real movement towards conciliation in the region, acted out entirely by regional players, not from the outside. And then the Arab Spring diverted all this stuff. So it's very, very possible for a country that, that helped create, the Syrian crisis, which killed over 500,000 people and displaced, over 10 million people. It's very possible for the Syrians and the Qataris and the Emiratis to reconcile with Syria. But of course, there will be a cost. There will be a price that they will have to pay, because they are on the losing side. They are much weaker than the alliance that Syria has found itself part of. And they'll have to pay the price for it. So yeah, it's actually not that odd that Saudi Arabia would be reaching out to Iran, because I think, especially when after Aramco was hit by the Houthis, reportedly, so precisely, as well, the Saudis and there was a non-US reaction, okay, and then the Iranians hit a supposedly undetectable US state-of-the-art drone okay, and downed it in one shot. And there was a non-US reaction, right? Or US non-reaction. The Saudis saw the writing on the wall and realized that they have to ease their own situation in the region before things get worse. So the Saudis aren't following the American lead absolutely now. I mean, they continue to be lured that way by people like Pompeo and other US strategists. But I think in the end, the Saudis will have to go back to their conservative thinking about how to approach this region and reestablish relations with adversaries in this region, and possibly even have a changing of the guard at the top in order to make this happen.
Okay, I'll go for one last question. I don't want to hold on to you for too long. But one interesting perspective that you give that maybe is missing to people in the West is that, in the media anyway, that you get this unsophisticated view of Iran and what the country's like, and we discussed this a little bit, and also kind of contrasting that with actually how Americans perceive themselves, but actually what their actions in the region have been. I mean, for pretty much 50 years have been, or 70 years, you can go that far back, just destabilizing everything. Well, I mean, so essentially the reports in the media that we get are, it's this dictatorship and regime, this kind of typical language of the government of Iran and the people of Iran. What would your kind of message be to Western people about what it's like in Iran, or what's the political environment?
Look, I did a two-part series investigation, whatever, on a trip to Iran I did in 2012-ish. I wrote this up in 2013, and I had gone to Iran to see why Iran was thriving in some weird way, despite sanctions. We've seen, when sanctions were applied on Iraq, the country suffered hugely. They say 500,000 children died from starvation during those sanctions. And but that wasn't clearly what was happening in Iran. So I went to sort of look into that, and I discovered that I met with heads of associations and industries. So I knew Iran was making huge strides in nanotechnology. I went and met some of the heads of the Nanotechnology Association there, and I went to meet the head of nuclear medicine at the University of Tehran, that had trained the nuclear medicine doctors around Iran, basically, and showed me that Iran doesn't have chemotherapy, it makes its own drug now because people won't sell it to them, and they use materials from their nuclear program to make this possible. And I met with so many different types of people, and one thing I heard consistently across the board when I said, what about sanctions? These officials would smile and say, well, sanctions is what helped us. There was a realization that despite sanctions, and in fact, because of sanctions, Iran had been forced into a position of assuming self-sufficiency as a national security priority, okay? Got to have your own food, you got to have your own water. Discovered that Iran was number 5 in the world in terms of agricultural output, that Iran had cloned sheep, because they decided, why were Iranian couples having to go overseas in order for fertility to get fertility treatments when it's so expensive? So they started their own, then they went to stem cell research. And all these little, micro industries and mega ones emerging in Iran. Iran's number 1 of 6 countries in the world to set standards for nanotechnology. All the rest are Western countries except for Japan, so forth and so forth. So I think one of the things you notice about Iran is that it's a country that is very different from other countries in this region. It does not believe in dependencies, the traditional thinking of, slavish native country under the economic or military, whatever, control of imperialist power. Iran didn't have a major debt like Syria, excuse me, depended on creating self-sufficiencies, as did Syria, and flourished, but not just in those areas. I mean, in terms of arts, Iranian movies winning at film festivals around the world, and in sciences, I remember in 2010 reading a Canadian a scientific journal that stated that Iran was #1 in the world in growth in scientific output. Iran is now #1 in the region in scientific output. Israel is #4. Okay, so here's a country that's going from strength to strength despite all this. Here's a country that is the focal point, the absolute target of NATO, the combined resources of NATO and the GCC, that is possibly the most secure country in the region, despite border attacks by US and Saudi and whatever funded groups on the Pakistani border, on the Afghani border, etc. And Iran has pushed back against these things by developing, by creating, by diversifying, but also through soft power, okay? And through this enormous amount of patience, which I, as a journalist, absolutely don't understand. They say Iran is, if you take a chess player and a carpet weaver, that's Iran. I mean, that's extraordinary strategic thinking, extraordinary patience, so Iran is uses its soft power and its self-sufficiencies and sanctions to build a state. I would say that in Iran, it's one of the few countries today in which you're seeing, national projects on those vast scales that used to exist, last century, and we don't seem to see anymore because everyone's looking for fast money, right? And that's, I think in a nutshell. So when you look at that and you realize that there must be a great deal of efficiency behind this project, because we're only talking about a 40-year period, right? Which, by the way, Iran has raised into like the higher category of human development indicator by the UNDP as well, just shooting up in all these areas despite sanctions. When you look at this, you understand that there's a certain mentality, a certain efficiency there that you don't typically see. You certainly don't see in the West anymore. So I would say to Americans who think we can blast your country to, into outer space, when Americans say things like that, they don't understand. They don't understand what they're dealing with. This is not a country that doesn't think through its moves and doesn't have plan A, plan B, plan C to Z available to. And if they launch these missile attacks on US bases in Iraq and did so carefully to minimize human casualties, even though they were military, you see a country that is, really knows what it's doing. And the West is afflicted with short-termism and ego and inefficiency, and, the opposite of Renaissance thinking, literally caveman kind of mentality. And I think they're up against an adversary that they don't understand. If they made an effort to understand, Iran would be a partner with all, because that's actually its MO. It is economy and development. Iran doesn't seek to be a nuclear power, it doesn't seek to be a military power. It spends very little on its military programs compared to the countries of the GCC, right, across the border. And, it's going to defend itself, but it would rather make friends and do business and develop, as we see with Russia and China. They don't want to get into fights. Even over Ukraine, what happened? It was like a bloodless thing in Crimea, right? So we're seeing a new trend, and I know that the Americans know this. I know that the U.S. military knows this in particular, because they do test their assumptions through red teaming and other, gaming exercises, etc.
I was reading about that this morning.
Yeah. There's no leadership in America, or even if there was, I'm not sure you could control that any one person or any one group of people could control the trajectory that the U.S. is on in foreign policy, because there's so many elements affecting it that the decision to attack Iran may not even be a decision that the president can make any longer. But
Well,
they need to be careful because they're up against an adversary that they won't see coming.
Well, I think I guess I've spoken about this a little bit in the past, where it's almost this kind of bogeyman to speak about it, but or some people think it's this weird thing that's a conspiracy theory, but the military-industrial complex, is a real thing. Of actually, there are people or companies that make a profit from going to war. Or it's funny when you saw Trump announce the withdrawal of troops from Syria. They announced the language was extremely funny, because they withdrew, but they had to protect this one oil base. I forgot the name of it, but in northeastern Syria.
The northeast, yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember what it was called, but it was, we have to protect this so it doesn't get into the hands of ISIS. But it was actually, U.S. military contractors that were just stealing this oil and shipping it across the border and stuff. But yeah, so it's,
he tried to get out of Syria twice, and he wasn't allowed to do that. So let's see what happens, because now there's a demand for Americans to get out of Iraq. There's not only a demand by the Iraqi parliament, but the prime minister has said he wants to work with Americans, and right now the Americans have rejected sitting down with their Iraqi counterparts to even talk about this. So in effect, the U.S. has just reoccupied Iraq. At the same time that the Iranians have promised, that the retaliation for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani will not be an in-kind retaliation. It will be a series of events that must lead up to U.S. military withdrawal from the Middle East. Not even specific to Iraq, Syria, but from the Middle East. But Iraq will be the first theater in which we'll see this happen. I feel bad for the Iraqis, but at this point, Iraq is posing a danger by allowing this uncontrolled, aggressive, superpower to exist within its borders, launching attacks on its neighboring state. Iran is well within its rights to respond to those attacks because they're coming from the neighboring state now, and the Iraqis have broken their contract with the Americans, right? They have said we rescind the contract we have with you to be here. We want you out. And so if the Iraqis are not willing to kick the Americans out, and the Americans continue to attack Iranian targets, Iran has to act in self-defense. Correct. So that changes the dynamic of things a bit. But Iran has said, next phase is for Iraqis who or people who want the Americans out. So their local allies will, I think, probably gear up to cause some damage to American military targets. I think Trump, if this happens, Trump just lost himself a re-election, which is interesting, because just a few weeks ago on one of these prediction shows, at the end of the year, I said, well, Trump will be re-elected because the Democrats can't get their act together. And I mean, the Democratic Party's become two parties. But in fact, Trump just did the one thing that is likely to alienate a nice chunk of his supporters and those independents who still would prefer him over a Democrat, and that is start a war,
But I mean, but to some, that sometimes increases your popularity, unfortunately.
Because he will get hit, and he will double down as he does, and it'll get worse and worse and worse, and Americans will die, and there'll be, because now everyone has a cell phone, there'll be visuals of this everywhere, and I mean, it will be a fiasco. I mean, they cannot, 18 years, and they have not been able to beat the Afghanis, the Taliban, and they're going to take on Iran with ballistic missiles that it's happy to use against U.S. targets. Just imagine that happened a few days ago. It's beyond
Mhm.
comprehension. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, yeah, we talked a little bit about my personal message to Americans that I'd like them to guess to understand, and we discussed this in our when we went for drinks, is that I guess this mentality, and I don't, without being too negative, I'll change my language so I don't sound too critical, but that idea of Americans needing to be the kind of global watchdogs, I think that sort of needs to die, because it's all well and good to protect international law, but actually international law has been broken the most by the United States in history. It's the only country, if you look at history, that repeatedly, over and over again, on many instances, and this is what I wrote about with the OPCW, but it's this assassination of not just Soleimani, so you're only hearing one name, but it was actually two senior politicians, because we had Abu Muhandis.
Yeah, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis,
Yeah.
Who was his counterpart. Yeah,
and so I think, and what this alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and these countries is it's all a reaction to the US. It's not something that's grown on its own. It's these countries deciding, where we've been on the receiving end of these sanctions or of these incursions into international sovereignty for so long that this is our only way to.
Well, it's ironic. They say if you're gonna place money on things, place money on the opposite of what America is trying to achieve in this region, or even globally, because of America's affliction with short-termism. What they are doing is undermining the very global order which has allowed them to thrive. So Henry Kissinger actually wrote about this six years ago or something. He talked about American interventionism. I mean, ironic that it comes from this guy, but American interventionism has become so severe and such a problem that it's undermining, by fraying away, by wearing down at the concept of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The US is undermining the very order which it leads, which is the nation state order. And the nation state unit is actually the unit that makes up our global order. So, and frankly, he was spot on. So the more the Americans do this, the more they undermine their own order. And it is falling apart. Again, why I call it World War III, because you have an absolute change in things, as well as a major power battle. I just, it's unfortunate, but I do not believe the US, under a Republican or a Democrat, a mainstream Democrat, will be able to comprehend this or be able to get off that trajectory. And so I anticipate an increasingly aggressive and more destructive US in the foreseeable future, as it claws to relevance, as it claws to the unipolarity that it's lost almost single-handedly through aggressions globally.
Yeah, and I think it links to that point of the military interests. They're not going to give up their interest in the Middle East easily, despite if it's a Republican or a Democrat in charge. And actually, it's funny because, Donald Trump, as a Republican, has been somewhat anti-militaristic, but that's why you've got this alliance between the sort of security state and the Democrats. And so you're getting these coordinated attacks between them, with things like Russiagate and, what was going on with Ukraine. It seems like the security agencies and the Democrats are kind of in this, in lockstep together, because they have the same interests. And if you look at the DNC leaks of what Hillary Clinton was saying to Wall Street, the Democratic Party have essentially sold themselves out to financial interests. So
the elite, this is what I think is bringing people on the left and bringing people on the right together. The elite establishment sucks, pretty much everywhere, and they have the same interests at heart, which is to keep themselves the elite establishment. And in order to be elite globally, as opposed to elite just financially or because you're a celebrity or something domestically, so in order to be an elite globally, you have to fundamentally believe in global dominance, okay? And so they will continue to, in order for the elite to remain the elite globally, they are the ones driving the American engine to, continue to dominate globally, economically, networks, militarily, etc. So in the end, it's the entire elite class that is the enemy and will be brought down, whether from the left or the right. Ironically, it's, and we did talk about this when we met in London, because it was in the aftermath of the Corbyn defeat. This so-called populism, which is being used as a negative term, which I think just means, people tired of their plight, democratically voicing this out. The elite would rather have a far-right winner of elections than a left, okay? Because the far right can and will probably be exploitative on issues that matter to them, finance, etc., maybe global hegemony, because of some kind of crazy nationalistic ideas and maybe even racism. And whereas the left will not. The left tends to be anti-elite, anti-hegemony, anti-war, etc. So they will, they will do anything to ensure a Jeremy Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders will not emerge victorious. And even as we see people like Tulsi Gabbard, who is adamantly anti-war, and that is the entire elite establishment, liberal all the way to the far right, that backs these issues. They are in lockstep on this. And so that's who we're going to have to upend if we want to see some changes.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, same here, Tareq. Good luck with this. I think it's a great project you're doing.
Thank you so much.
All right.